All right, y'all ready for me to start? I'm sharing my screen. How do I do this?
You want to share your presentation, right?
Yes.
Where's your presentation?
Oh, it's right over here. It's on my screen. It's this one right here. Ooh, and we need to move up. Thank you, people, for being patient. There you go. Now what do I do?
You want to share that?
I do.
And hit share.
It's very sad that I actually need this kind of help. I very much appreciate everybody's patience, and I really wanted to welcome you all to vote by mail in Ohio, the best way to do it. And of course, that's always really the challenge, is that, you know, we have this opportunity to hear from other people. We just went through what was difficult, to say the least, and all of a sudden having to change to vote by mail. And so we want to have a sense of what other states are doing, and we want to have a thoughtful conversation about, well, what do we do as we move towards November? And so I wanted to welcome you all. I am Catherine Turcer with Common Cause Ohio. I'm so pleased that you're joining us. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to move to the next slide. So our panelists, now we're very blessed. From Oregon, we have Titus. Now, and we have Amanda Gonzalez. From Ohio, our Ohio experts are Jen Miller and Camille Wimbish. Now, one of the things that I really like is that this is an all-girl panel, so this is a girl power panel. And so, you know, I also wanted to highlight to you all that you need to look down to the bottom of the screen. There's an area that says Q&A. And so if you have a question, please add it in there. And then I have my trusty assistant will help me actually ask the questions. Now, you notice we have a vote by mail hashtag and a fair elections hashtag. I think that can be really helpful because, you know, we're having the challenge of having these conversations where we can't have them in person as much right now. And so doing these things online, using your time on social media, those are the hashtags that we've got. Now, Kate Titus is our first batter up here. She is from Common Cause, Oregon. She's the executive director. She was previously with Public Citizen and Oregon Action. Amanda Gonzalez from Common Cause, Colorado is the executive director there, and she is on a number of boards, including the Colorado Fiscal Institute and the Colorado Hispanic Bar Association. For our Ohio experts, we have Camille Wimbish of Ohio Voice, and she's the one that helps coordinate the Ohio Voter Rights Coalition. So if you've heard of the Ohio Voter Rights Coalition, that's Camille. Then we have Jen Miller, who is the executive director of the League of Women Voters. She also comes to us from the Sierra Club. So she has a rich understanding of the kind of environmental challenges that Ohio faces. And she's a jazz singer. Ooh, by the way, I also forgot to mention this. Camille is on the board of the Columbus Zoo. So other things to ask her, you know, I know, isn't that fun? Now, today we have, our agenda is pretty simple. We're going to do a history of voting by mail. And then we're going to, a little bit about like how voting works. And so we're going to take it state by state. So we're going to do Colorado, Oregon, and Ohio. And then we're going to have a conversation a little bit about like, well, what are some results? And then what are the problems or challenges with vote by mail? Finally, how do different states address vote by mail security concerns? Many of us don't necessarily want to have Donald Trump be a part of every conversation, but we're also going to talk a little bit about you know, Donald Trump not liking vote by mail so much. We're also going to talk a little bit about, well, how should we plan? How should we plan for the November elections? And then we're going to take your questions. A big thank you to all those folks who actually gave me questions in advance. And with that, I'm actually going to hand this over to my friend Amanda to walk us through how it works in Colorado.
Perfect. And thanks so much for having me, everyone. I'm always excited to talk about Colorado's system. And because we're so proud of it, it works really well for voters. And I think there are a couple different key pieces. And so what I'll do first is just kind of walk you through what our system looks like, and then happy to answer questions when we get to that portion of the agenda. So here are some of the aspects that we are most proud of in our current system here in Colorado. So the first thing is that we have online voter registration and electronic poll books. This enables us to do the fifth thing on my list, which is same-day voter registration. And so we also have really proactive list maintenance. So we mail ballots to every registered voter in the state for a November election that happens about mid-October. And if you're going to mail ballots to every registered voter in your state, it's really important that those ballots get to the correct address, right? And before we passed these major reforms, most of these happened in 2013. And prior to that, our clerks here in Colorado were sending out all kinds of reminders. They were getting election materials returned to them. They'd have to send a postcard. And we really simplified the process with the legislation that we passed in 2013. And it was an important part of the system. And just because we mail ballots to everyone who's registered to vote in the state doesn't mean that people don't have in-person options, right? We know that we have a wide diversity of voters in Colorado, and that's really important. It's important that everybody is able to cast their ballot and have that ballot accurately counted as long as they're eligible to vote. Whether or not you are somebody that, has a home, to be honest, right? We have folks that are experiencing homelessness. We have folks that have to move frequently. I think maybe a little bit more frequently in the time of COVID. We know that we have voters that need language assistance, or we have voters with disabilities that might need a little bit more help. So it's really important that we have in-person options. And here it's a vote center model. So we have voter service and polling centers in every single county. And I've mentioned same-day registration, so you can go to a vote center, a VSPC, at that VSPC, you can register and vote on the same day. And then the other two important pieces are that we used to have an inactive fail to vote status. So if you hadn't voted in 2 elections, you were no longer actively registered to vote. And we changed that so that people who were registered to vote were always getting their ballots, even if they didn't vote in the last couple of elections. And then the final really important piece is that we have drop boxes located all throughout Colorado. We actually radically increased the number of drop boxes starting in 2019. Because that's actually the preferred method for voters here. So upwards of 90% of people in Colorado do vote the ballot that is mailed to them, but most of them don't actually mail it back. They take it and drop it off at a voter service center or in one of those drop boxes in their neighborhoods. So it's pretty great. I think we do a really good job of meeting voters where they're at and making it pretty convenient to cast your ballot. So in the next slide, I'll talk about kind of how we got here. And I'm sorry that came out a little tiny. Hopefully you can see okay. But this was not a process that happened overnight. We did implement pretty quickly beginning in 2013 with those last round of major changes, but this was a process that was really more than a decade in the making. I started my little timeline for our purposes tonight in 2007. That was when Colorado got a permanent mail-in voter status. So I actually moved to Colorado in 2008. When I registered to vote, I filled out my voter registration form. I think I was at a Pride Fest. And it had a little box on there that said, would you like your ballot to just be mailed to you? I was like, yeah, that sounds good. And so my ballot was always mailed to me. And in fact, by 2012, so the year before we passed those major reforms in 13, about 72% of ballots cast were cast through this permanent vote by mail status. So Colorado was already largely voting by mail even before our major reforms. In 2008, we updated SCORE, which is our statewide voter database, so that we had electronic poll books and all the counties could easily talk to each other. It really simplified things. created the opportunity to have mail ballot primaries in 2009. And then in 13, we passed the Colorado Voter Access and Modernization Act. If you want to look that up, it was House Bill 1303, if you are curious about that language in Colorado. But that was the one that established most of those reforms that I talked about in the previous slide. And then I can walk you through our process and sort of what voting in Colorado in the weeks leading up to the election looks like. And so the slide that you now have in front of you is days before the election, right? So 22 days before our election, voter registration drives end. You do have to be a resident of Colorado for 22 days to be eligible to vote. Even though we don't have a registration deadline, you do have to have been here for 22 days. So our voter registration drives end 22 days in advance. Beginning at that point, ballots begin being mailed to voters, and they go out up to 8 days before. And again, it's important that we have those in-person options, because once you receive your ballot, if you only got it 8 days before, that's probably not enough time to mail it back to your county clerk. And so you can drop it off at a drop box or a VSPC. Those voter service and polling centers open 15 days before the election. So we have early voting for about 2 weeks before the election, or you just want to vote in person, you don't want to vote at home, you need assistance, you want to register to vote, you spilled wine all over your ballot, whatever you got going on, VSPCs are there for you 2 weeks in advance, and you can go to anyone in your county. So it's not a precinct model. You don't have to just go to the elementary school that's near your house. As I mentioned, day 8, we stopped mailing ballots, but if you didn't get yours, or you were like, oh shoot, I forgot to register at my current address, you can still go into a vote center. And then, like I said, you can register and vote up to the last day of the election. So it's pretty great here.
How many vote centers do you have per county, Amanda?
It depends on the size of the county. And it also scales up over that 15-day period. So a county may only be required to open a handful of vote centers that 15 days out, but maybe they, in some cases, triple the number in the last 2 days before the election, because turns out we are all procrastinators, even when we have really great vote systems. And so lots of folks are voting on that last couple days of the election.
And how about how many drop boxes per county?
We also change that formula, and it is also dependent on size of county, but I can send that to Catherine, who can distribute it out, because we also updated it last year.
Well, fortunately, we'll have an opportunity to ask Amanda some more questions, but now it's time for Kate Titus, who is with Common Cause Oregon. Kate, are you ready to take it away?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for taking a little time to think about vote by mail together tonight. I think it's a subject worth spending some time thinking about right now while we're all in this pandemic. I'll tell you a few things about Oregon's system, but it generally mirrors other vote by mail systems. There's slight variations, but it's similar. So what I want to start with is actually talking a little bit about how we got here in Oregon, because this gradual early implementation is, I think, one of the strengths. Oregon was a front runner on this. And I know that states that are trying to expand rapidly right now in this changing environment have some different challenges. But we've been able to work on this over time and really perfect the system more. So a few details about how we got here. First, this goes back decades. 1981, the Oregon legislature passed a test program that counties could opt to run county elections by a mail system if they chose to. And it wasn't something anyone had to do, and it wasn't for statewide elections. But in those first years, a few of the counties started trying it and very much liked it. So we got started that way, and it was working well. And so we had the legislature then went back and made that that experiment permanent but only for county elections in 1987. By that point, by 87, actually most counties were using it already because the county officials would talk to each other and they realized it was so much easier. So they started adopting it voluntarily, and in 87, we made it a permanent thing for local elections. The first statewide election, though, didn't happen until 1993, that entirely by vote by mail. And that particular 93 election, it was a ballot measure, a pretty wonky urban renewal bond measure that was complicated and boring, and it failed, in fact, the measure. But the turnout for that measure was higher than would have been expected. There wasn't a lot else on the ballot. And to have this, I think it was 39% turnout rate for that particular measure was a good showing. So, you know, it was a gradual process. The voters were getting used to this all around the state. Then there was a window before before Oregon became a full vote by mail state. 94 and 96 were two elections that actually started to create a partisan color to this, where there was opposition from the parties. Interestingly, it switched. First, the Republicans supported it, and then the Democrats supported it. So, you know, and there has been some back and forth at different times who thinks it's working to their advantage or to their opponent's advantage. But in 94, there was an election that wasn't even vote by mail, but the Republicans organized the absentee ballots. So you had an incumbent for Congress running, who everyone assumed would win. She had a 10,000 vote lead as they were doing the count on election night. And then suddenly, as they're starting to count the absentee ballots, that gap closed. And she did win, but it was only by a few hundred votes. So it brought a lot of attention to the idea of mail votes, but these were absentee votes and how it could be organized. And Democrats were sure that the system was working to the Republicans' advantage. Really what happened is the Republicans had organized their mail-in voters. Then 2 years later, in 96, there was another congressional election. This time it was a vote by mail. It was a special election and it was held by vote by mail. Every voter in Oregon got a ballot for it, and there was a Democrat and a Republican running for a seat that had neither of them the incumbent, and the Democrat pulled it out in this case, and so the Republicans started to feel like vote by mail actually works to the Democrats' advantage. And what's interesting about that is that I think that's something that all of us will experience all around the country, is that parties tend to watch this and look very carefully at the partisan advantage. Is this going to help me, or is it going to help my opponent? They're very myopic. Everything's in their own interest. And at times it will favor one or the other, but what we see is that it's not really a system that's meant to support one party or the other. It supports the voters. It's in voters' best interest. And so we will have opposition from whatever party thinks it's in the best interest of their opponent. So after that 94 election, what happened was the Republicans, who controlled the state legislature at the time, tried to make vote by mail permanent in Oregon, and the Democrats opposed it, and the Democratic governor vetoed it. After the 26 election, the Democrats had a change of heart, and they started to try to pass it through the legislature, but the Republicans opposed it. So, you know, the political nature of this is something to consider in terms of getting it passed. Ultimately, it was in 1998 we got it passed as a ballot measure because the voters did support it. And by that point, the voters, it had become the most popular way to vote in Oregon. Not all elections, not all the state elections were by mail, but all the local elections were. And election officials had realized that it was a easier thing to administer and that it was popular with voters. So they started encouraging people to sign up as permanent absentee voters. And so by 98, I think it was like 60-something% of the voters were voting by permanent absentee ballot anyway. Voters passed it. It went into effect for the 2020 election. And so Oregon became the first state with a full vote by mail in a presidential election that year. That was still as far back as 2020 when this happened. And so you can imagine there have been changes along the way that have improved the situation that we're in and fine-tuned it since. Okay.
So Kate, I wanted to do a shout out right now to Peg Rosenfield of the Legal Women Voters of Ohio. So she actually took many trips to Oregon during that time period where there was a back and forth and what should we do? And she actually wrote a book on vote by mail for the Federal Elections Commission. So as we're thinking about that,
nice.
You're on there somewhere, just wanted to do a shout out. Kate, are you ready to change your slide?
Yes, yes. So just a few words on the Oregon system. I don't think it's particularly different, but I think the things to highlight, one is it starts with voter registration and having a good voter registration system. You know, even after Oregon went to full vote by mail 2020, it wasn't until a few years later that we created a statewide registration database because the databases were county by county. And that made it so that when people registered, when they moved over a county line and re-registered, automatically that would get updated. I mean, the details matter and things like that are important. After that, we set up online voter registration, which makes things much easier. People can go on and they can change their party affiliation, update their contact information, they can register online. They can sign up to have their ballot tracked and get updates of where it is in the counting process. All those things can happen pretty easily online. And then in 2015, we were the first state in the country to pass automatic voter registration. How it works here is with the DMV. It doesn't catch everyone, but a lot of people interact with the DMV getting their license or other things. And they will be registered if they weren't already registered. And if their contact information has changed, that will be updated. So those things create a good voter registration base to begin with, and that's really important with vote by mail. I will say the other thing about voter registration is vote by mail is helpful because usually, I think this is true in all systems, if the ballot, when it's sent to every voter, will not be forwarded if that voter is no longer at that address. And so that goes back, the election division can follow up and check that out. But if that person has gone, they are no longer active. And so it's a good way to keep the lists up without purging voters unnecessarily, but purging them when they should be. A few other things, you know, it's really important on the return end to make it as accessible to everyone. We've just moved this is the first election we have where the return ballots are postage paid. So that's great, makes it a lot easier for most people. But not posted, mailing a ballot is not the easiest way for everyone, and options are important. We have drop boxes and sites at the county election offices themselves are all places where you can return ballots. And then there's the ballot tracking system I mentioned where you can sign up online and get text messages or emails telling you that your ballot's been received, your ballot's been counted, et cetera. I just want to emphasize that, you know, even though vote by mail work is more convenient and more efficient for the vast majority of people, every voter situation is different, and that's why alternatives and options matter. And so a good vote by mail system also has alternatives, in-person options for people who might need a little assistance. Certain people with certain disabilities find it easier to vote by mail, but other disabilities find it harder to vote independently by mail. And so we have some alternatives where, you know, people can call their election office and even have volunteers come out with special equipment to help them vote. You can get access for language assistance, or maybe, as Amanda said, you know, you've spilt wine on your ballot. So whatever it is, there's got to be alternatives for that. And the final thing I would just add about Oregon's situation is, having had this now and developed it over decades, we really have a vote by mail culture that has developed around it that I think creates a healthy civic culture of voting. And I know that there are some people who have not experienced vote by mail who think, you know, well, you lose the feeling of going out to the poll and standing in the line and wearing the sticker. And I think that's a good thing for us to do. It builds civic character. But actually, I think you'd be surprised how much that happens in a different way in vote by mail. People start calling their friends and families and, hey, you know, I got my ballot in the mail. It's due in a few weeks. I've been looking it over. There's some of the things I don't know about. Do you know anything about this candidate? Do you know about this? And so people discuss their ballots. We also have a neutral voter pamphlet that the government puts out every election that lists everything that's on it, and has each candidate can put in their own statement, endorsers can put in statements, and there's kind of like neutral description of the ballot measures. It's dry. It's like, you know, it's not as exciting as the full color flyers that people send as advertisements. A poll not that many years ago showed that Oregonians, like something in the 90%, it was like 96% of voters rely on the voter pamphlet, and some also high number, 80%, said they read every single thing in it, which I don't even do. It blew my mind. I mean, it's a popular source. So people become more engaged in educating themselves and talking. Oregonians even have vote parties. They'll bring their friend, they'll have a party and people will bring their ballots, and they'll have speakers who present about different issues and debate them, and then people vote for themselves what they're going to vote, or they take their ballot home and decide later. But so I think it does create, vote by mail can create a really rich culture of educated, informed voting. I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Well, not surprisingly, things are a little different in Ohio. And here to talk about it, we have Jen Miller and Camille Wimbish. And I'm so glad that you're doing this together, because I think the story of Ohio is a complicated one. And just like when you need me to move things.
Thank you, Catherine, and welcome. I wanted to take us back a few years, back to the 2004 election, to really where the story of vote by mail started in Ohio. Many of you may recall the long lines and the black eye that we earned on election night. Voters were standing in lines enduring the rain for up to 10 hours in many places all over the state. And it was really a moment in time where voters really started to think there has to be a better way. And in fact, there's a ballot initiative that grew out of that in response to this public outcry to do better and to really abandon the absentee voting system that we had, which basically said you had to be, you know, over 62, you had to be out of the county to request an absentee ballot. And so sort of out of this need to, you know, address the public outcry, and, you know, the legislatures were sort of acting actually in their own self-interest and wanting to defeat the Citizens Initiative, as Catherine could tell you many stories about. The legislature actually decided in 2005 to pass no-fault absentee voting so that voters no longer need an excuse to vote by mail. And so that's where we started, and we have been using no-fault absentee voting for well over a decade now. Next slide. So just briefly, the vote by mail process in Ohio is a little bit complicated. There's a multi-step process that really starts with voters having to fill out an absentee ballot request form. Now we know in this primary, it was the light of COVID-19, it became even more difficult for folks to figure out how to engage in vote by mail, because folks suddenly weren't able to access printers at work, or they were not able to go to the library and you know, use a printer there. And so folks have to fill out that ballot application. They can print one. There's unfortunately not a way for folks to get a ballot request online. So that's an obstacle for folks. Or they have to call the Board of Elections to get one. And many people even thought, well, I'll call the Board of Elections and let them know I want an absentee ballot. But actually that just gets them to mail a ballot to you. The voter actually has to continue along the process and fill out the ballot request and send it in. So finding the postage, send it in. And then once they send it in and the board processes that application, they have to wait for a ballot to come back. And so it's, again, a multi-step process before voters can actually vote that ballot. And we have a generous period of around 29 days to do that voting, but it can, particularly in a primary like this, it can mean that there's really very little room for error. Jen, was there anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I think you're doing great. We should all know that we do like no excuse absentee processes. We all supported that. So Common Cause and the League supported that in Ohio and obviously championed that. But we had flagged before this election just a lot of the challenges that we see. And we do have, I think, Aaron Ackerman of the election officials on, as well as our mail carrier, the president of our Mail Carrier Association. And I just want to say that in this primary, we need to understand that it wasn't just voters who were set up for extreme challenges, but so were the boards of elections and the mail service, in that we had a short turnaround. I think the thing that we heard from both Oregon and Colorado is that it takes a while to develop a really good vote by mail system and implement it. You can't just blink your eyes, which is what we saw here in Ohio. So some of these, benefits of voting by mail, there can be cost savings. It can be a lot easier because just like early voting, it's good for all voters because it's reducing that strain on election day. We should expect again this fall to have challenges with poll worker recruitment. And so those folks who do vote early or vote by mail, they're really helping the entire system. Clearly there are safety concerns in the face of COVID-19, but there are also, of course, going to be people that, maybe they're immune compromised and it's flu season anyway. And so I think we are certainly, there's some chat coming about all the challenges that we saw in this primary, and those are very true, and we saw those widespread. I think the answer is not to completely abandon vote by mail. The answer is to figure out what we can do better because it's a good part of the solution. That doesn't mean that Ohio is going to really make it the primary mode of voting anytime soon, but it can be a much better, more attractive menu item for voters. And so that's something we'll talk more about. What's our next slide? So yeah, the drawbacks are that we do have, and for us in Ohio, the drawbacks are particularly challenging, right? We have a situation where, especially during this COVID process, a lot of us were at home, so we didn't have printers, right? A lot of us print either at a library or a school or our office building. Many folks don't even necessarily have internet. And since we can't request these ballots online, that was one of the first real challenges. You add to that you had to mail that application in. You could drop it off, very few people were mostly mailing that in, but a lot of us don't have stamps. You can't only get singular stamps at the grocery store. I mean, at the post office. If you're going for the grocery store, you had to get a whole book, which then turns into an affordability issue if we're thinking about people who are furloughed potentially and making choices about their money. So the multi-step process, we also just very much understand that, again, like our hardworking mail service was also very much suffering with the pandemic. And so there's going to take longer time to get mail to folks. Of course, we did see some that did not have postmarks, but I think some really important things is that we only have one secure drop box per county, and that really hurts rural voters as much as it hurts voters who may depend on, for example, public transit in places like Columbus. And so I just want to point out that we are in the game, like Kate, I think, said it well about this partisan gaming potentially, or who votes by mail, or if we make this access, it's going to mean so-and-so wins over so-and-so. I'm going to be real clear that yes, we saw challenges among low-income voters and voters of color, or students that overall may lean a little more progressively, but we also in this primary saw significant challenges by senior citizens, rural Ohioans, who likely are more likely to lean conservatively. And so I think we need to continue to be making the case to our legislators that access cuts, and challenges to access cuts in every direction.
Before we go a little bit more deeply into the primary, I had a couple questions, and this is for all the panelists. I was just wondering about how vote by mail impacts turnout. I think this is something that Kate touched a little bit on. I'd also like to hear from Amanda in Colorado, like how has this impacted turnout?
Yeah, so it's had a really positive effect on turnout. The first election that we ran under our new model was actually an off-year election. So in 2013, we got a good trial run, and we saw a 40% increase in voters turnout in 2013 for that off-year election. In 2018, of course, it depends on how you crunch these numbers, but we had 76.5% of active voters actually voted. And that was about 64% of eligible voters in our state. So depending on the metrics you're using, I think we fall just behind Minnesota in voter turnout. But by making our elections more accessible to voters, we've seen them actually participate in civic life in much more meaningful numbers.
Kate, did you have anything you wanted to add? All right, next batter up. So we've talked a little bit about, does it favor one political party over the other? One of the questions that I had in the back of my mind was, do you think it makes a like vote by mail makes a difference, not when it comes to one party over another, but when it comes to a city versus rural versus suburban, does it make a difference that way?
So I actually think just like we see food deserts in the urban core and in rural Ohio, both, I think actually when we have access challenges, they're both directions, right? And especially this concept that we only have one early voting center per county and we only have one drop-off center per county. So if you're in a large rural county, that means you may drive, and I'm a country girl originally from Ohio. I can tell you that means that you could drive over an hour to try to early vote or drop your ballot. That's not okay, right? And if you are trying to rely on transportation, you're a senior, you're a person with a disability who lives in rural Ohio, the transit authorities may not even run cross county. So I think that is a challenge just as much as, perhaps you're someone who is working multiple jobs and you're trying to get into the vote center in a very short amount of time, and there's only one and it's not close to your house, right? And you're stuck in traffic instead. So I personally think that we see both. And that's why we often hear from election officials, rural and urban counties, Republican and Democrat, for things like multiple early vote centers, in any election.
So for the states that are on that have more robust vote by mail, are there challenges for different populations?
Yeah, for sure.
Mute. Go ahead, Kate.
I'm going to echo what Jen said. I think it plays out in different ways for different people, but it affects both parties and people of different constituencies. But so it may be unique challenges for some, but there's challenges enough to go around. And I think what the challenge is, if you're in an abusive or dangerous situation, you've got a situation, whether there's vote by mail or not, that most public voter lists are public, and you may not want your address. You may be in hiding. You may there may be an extra layer if you're getting a ballot mailed to you, that if you're in a abusive situation where you feel endangered to even get and freely fill out your. But then the alternative or the remedy for that is to make sure that people can sign up for to not have their information listed. They can be part of a protected class that doesn't have their information public. They can also choose an alternative than having their ballot mailed to them. So that's just one example. You've got people with different kinds of disability, some of which a mail-in option it makes things so much easier, and you've got some that it makes it harder. So you're working with your disability communities to identify the different needs and make sure that there is options. Also, people voting overseas, whether they're military or not, that's another population that's a special needs population, and you have to set up a system. Generally, vote by mail is congruent with voting overseas, but there are issues like it takes time for mail to go back and forth, and if you mail a ballot out 3 weeks ahead in state, you need to really mail it earlier than that for overseas people to give them enough time to mail it back. And sometimes that conflicts with your dates. People haven't even filed for certain elections, and you're trying to get the information out to overseas military in time. So there are specific issues that you have to contend with for different populations and different needs.
I think the other thing to keep in mind is that these can't be static systems, right? Our populations are constantly changing, and how we interact with voting systems are constantly changing. And so even though here in Colorado, we're very proud of our model, we're also updating it pretty regularly. So there was a question earlier about number of VSPCs per county. It varies by size of county, but I pulled the numbers as we were chatting. 15 days before an election, Denver has to have one for, or if you're a large county like Denver, you have to have one for every 75,000 electors, but by election day, it's one for every 12,500. So that means that the city of Denver has approximately 50 VSPCs throughout their county. And then to Kate's point about who's able to access the system, Izzy, I think we're getting some extra noise from you. About who's able to access that system, we actually changed it in 2019 so that you could, if you were a voter with visual impairments, you could receive the ballot electronically, print it out, and get it back to a vote center using your assistive technology. So it's just the case that we can't sit on our laurels, and we can't just assume that we've got the right system.
Oh, Hazel died.
Izzy, so Izzy, just so you know, we can hear what you're saying.
You're a little hot dog, huh, Hazel?
Somebody needs to text Izzy and tell her all about Hazel.
Yeah, I'm trying to reach Izzy. Hold on a second.
Okay.
No, it's okay. Hazel works better than on every coworker's children interruption.
Uh-oh, hold on, sorry.
Yes.
Unfortunately, she is the host. So I have no power over her.
Patient.
Great.
What I was going to tell you all is that the next section we have coming up really has to do with a little more in-depth look at the primary. And so this is something that Camille and Jen are going to talk a little bit about. And then thanks to everybody for your patience. And Jen and Camille, take it away.
Well, yeah, so I think we touched on some of these issues, but as we all know, our primary was not ideal. We had a April 28th deadline, which, as Jen mentioned, was really not sufficient time to run a fully a vote by mail election. There was very little room for error for voters to get their requests in, get them mailed back, and get their ballots. voters received a postcard with information about how to get their ballots, but they didn't actually receive an application. So again, there are many steps in this process. And so there were also, mail delays that were in many places 7 to 9 days. So with only a couple of weeks to turn around elections, and boards of elections were also scrambling to figure out how in the world to adjust to the COVID-19 issues, getting enough printing, materials like envelopes, figuring out how to do all the social distancing necessary. It really was sort of, Herculean efforts to try to pull this off. So we're, incredibly grateful to all of our boards who are working so hard, and for the voters who were trying to persevere through all the things that they needed to do to get their ballots in. But we really want to do better when we think about our election this fall. This slide is really just to sort of show, part of the problem, that while we did have a really large increase in absentee ballot that were requested, 1.9 million ballots were requested this year, which was an all-time record. The day before Election Day, there were already about 500,000 ballots that were still outstanding that the boards of elections had not received. And so that shows you that, as there's procrastination at work, there's, difficulties getting the printing and the postage and the, communications in the mail from the boards of election at work. But essentially, folks needed more time to do this election. And we know that ballots have continued to come in, but we also want to be mindful of the voters who got left behind, who maybe didn't realize about the deadline, or they didn't realize that there were conditions for voting in person on election day, or they weren't able to receive their ballot in time. And so
or they were denied their request. They put their kid's birthday instead of theirs, and they ran out of time to request another one, be another group. Sorry.
For sure. No. Jen, are there other things that you wanted to add?
No, I mean, I would just say, look, we're seeing questions about, can Ohio be a vote by mail state by the November. First off, there's no such thing as a 100% vote by mail state. So we can be more of a vote by mail state than we are now, but all vote by mail, like states that are where vote by mail is the primary methodology, or the majority of voters choose vote by mail, they're still in-person voting. And it's not just for a few select categories like we saw this time, persons with disability, persons who didn't have an address, were experiencing homelessness, and people who had applied for a ballot but did not get it in time. And so I think, again, the message is that I think there's a couple important messages. The first is, yes, we need to improve it, and there's a lot of things we can do there. But two, I think it was really hard for boards of elections and voters alike to constantly be having all of these changes to the system, right? We were on our third date, lots of different ways. Like half of our county boards of elections don't even have their in-house printing, and then again, printers are also in the middle of a pandemic. And so we have to be planful for the future elections this year, so that we are not putting everyone through the roller coaster that set us all up for undue challenges.
Camille, do you have anything else you'd like to add?
I don't think so. There was this slide right here was really just to say, as you mentioned, that the person who occupies the White House came out and said he was not a fan of vote by mail. And I think, some folks may be interested to, maybe worried about vote by mail, but I think the secretary really hit the nail on the head when he said, in Ohio, we have been voting by mail for quite some time. It works here, it's secure, we can make it better. So let's roll up our sleeves and get to work on making it better.
And I would just add to that, look, you have to prove, because there have been questions about ballot harvesting and questions about fraud and things like that. And here's the deal, the way that you prove yourself on your ballot is information that you can't just Google, right? It's not like our social security number or our driver's license or state ID number is just all over the planet. It's not like what's your dog's name or what's your mother's maiden name. And so there are ways to prove every voter, you can prove that they are who they are. And again, there's a whole concept about double voting, but here's the bottom line is if someone was mailed a ballot and let's say they didn't get it, or they decide they want to vote in person. Sorry, I feel like my dog's going to bark here in a minute. I can see him at attention. So I'm, you know, if that happens, what happens is if like, let's say you were mailed a ballot and then you go to vote in person, you're going to get a provisional ballot. And that is so that they can guarantee that you didn't already vote. There's really not double voting. I mean, the only real concern we might have is like maybe in the undue influence category where, you know, at the moment that the ballots come out, then, you know, a county commissioner candidate decides to provide free lawn mowing for a whole bunch of people, you know, like stuff like that would be a concern. But again, I think we have, that's not stealing elections, that's not election fraud, and we have other ways to deal with that issue.
Oh, hang on, how do I unmute this? So Jen, one of the questions that that I had to do with you used the phrase ballot harvesting, and I got worried that not everybody would actually know what you were talking about when it came to ballot harvesting. What is that exactly?
Well, I feel like maybe someone knows what that is better than I do. It just means that, you know, someone else is, you know, grabbing ballots and voting, you know, pretending there's someone, you know, in large numbers, you know, pretending there to be voters, basically purposefully committing fraud through the mail process at large enough numbers that it could impact an election. And yes, we have seen a few cases of this in other states, but number one, they were caught, right? And number two, it's really rare. And number three, Ohio has its own system that I think makes that really hard.
So Kate, can you tell us a little bit about the kind of security mechanisms you have so that you're sure that the person who is sending in or putting their vote by mail ballot in a ballot box, that is in fact that person casting a ballot? Can you tell me a little bit of how you do election security?
Yeah, a couple things. So first of all, a lot of it comes down to signature verification, and the people who do that are trained. There's a process, you know, the ballot comes back in a security envelope, but then outside of that is the signature. So the signatures are verified, and it's only after the verification happens that the ballot gets then dropped in the box. The people that they're using scanner equipment, they're also visually comparing it to a computer generated signature that you have on file. And if there are problems, they then have to follow up. If they suspect it might not be, they follow up with the voter. It's called curing the ballot. There's a problem with the ballot. And one of the advantages of vote by mail is some number of people start voting in advance. And so you can start curing ballots that have signature problems in advance and get some of that done. Whereas on a voting system where it's all the day of, you've suddenly got all these ballots that are questionable and you're trying to cure them, and you can't do it in a reasonable amount of time. So that's an advantage. But there's all sorts of reasons why people's signatures might not match. You know, they might have injured their hand. They might have just been over time gradually changing, or they've developed Parkinson's and they're more shaky. But it could also be a forgery. And so there's that call, and people have to actually come in and verify their ballot to make it count. It's a hassle for the people when that happens, but it is a security measure that ensures that only true ballots are getting in. The other thing I would say is about the security measures, you know, there's always possibilities. You could steal a person's ballot. You could fill it out for them. You could steal one out of the mail. It's a felony to steal people's mail, but you know, you might look up and find you know somebody just died and it probably they haven't gotten off the records yet because it just happened, and so their ballot's going to come and you could you could steal it and return it. The thing is, those are all one by one small. Fraud is only really effective at a massive scale, and so it's actually, vote by mail is a harder thing to game than a voting machine that you hack into in the software. That's where you're going to get hundreds, thousands of votes all at once. But trying to get past one by one with these ballots that are being sent to all of these different individuals and have to be signed and then have to be cured if the signature doesn't match up is a trickier thing to fraudulently rig.
Amanda, do you want to tell us a little bit about the security procedures in Colorado?
So it's a very similar process. Colorado accepts one of 16 different types of ID when you register to vote. Those include tribal IDs, and so you do have to show an ID when you register to vote. You also have to show an ID when you interact at a voter service and polling center. We have a similar signature verification process as what's happening in Oregon. So in our signature files, we have almost every signature that you've ever given to the government. So when you were at the DMV, when you registered to vote. So for somebody like me who's been voting for a while, I probably have 25 signatures on file that they're comparing with. And so for cure process, so if your signature doesn't match, you get a letter, and depending on your county, you have various ways to cure that signature. In some counties, there's actually an app that you can use. It's a pretty robust process. We don't see high amounts of fraud, but I think that it actually has inspired a lot of confidence in the system because of this culture of civic engagement, that everybody is voting, that we do have high voter turnout, and people do really trust the system and feel like they're better able to have their voice heard.
I would just say we've had questions about signature matching, and that is a challenge in Ohio, but I think so what Amanda just pointed out is that, how many different person's signature, so that there are some slight differences. It's not just one signature that you are comparing to that maybe was from when you were 18 years old and you're like, I don't know what now, so I think that's really interesting. I think right now, one of our concerns about signature verification is that there's not a lot of uniformity between counties. And that's something we would like to see. I think it can be unscientific. And so, one of the concerns we have is that the signature matching is part of requesting your absentee ballot, but you are proving who you are in so many other ways. And that a lot of times people are then getting denied for their absentee ballot, and then they have to try to apply again and again. And that is a real problem. We also have that challenge with provisional ballots on election day. So I think, again, part of the argument is what we're hearing is people are trusting signatures as being a security piece, but then there are probably really strong best practices that Ohio should emulate in that regard.
Well, and now we're on to November 2020 in Ohio. And so, this is something that Camille put together, this notion of like, well, what are our next steps? What should we actually be advocating for? So Camille or Jen, if you want to jump in and paint a picture for what it is, where are we going? What should we do?
So I think you're going to be hearing more from us in the coming days and weeks about how exactly we want you guys to take action. We're certainly going to need all hands on deck, but essentially what we want to make sure that we have in place for November is that we have a fully funded vote by mail program so that voters have, prepaid postage. We want to make sure that there's certainly enough voter education about the process. Something around the lines of 75% of voters typically vote on election day, and so they really need some education about how the process works. We know we're going to need some more funds to make sure that boards of elections are prepared. They have the security upgrades they need, and they're able to do the massive vote by mail program that we're needing to do. We're looking for some more emergency contingency planning so that we're not in the same place. We're not just sort of doing this on the fly, but we have a plan in place for these types of emergencies. As we mentioned, we definitely want to make sure that we have multiple in-person voting options available for folks, so that if you're in a rural county or you're in an urban county, people don't have to drive so far to access, drop boxes, and they're able to also vote in person if they do not choose to vote by mail. And then lastly, it's a super common sense reform. We would like to have online absentee ballot requests so that folks don't have to go through the hoops of finding stamps and paper and printing and postage and all of that. So those are sort of the basics. We're going to be launching some more letters and calls to action that will certainly keep you all informed about.
But in the meantime, I think it's really important, if you found the primary frustrating or challenging, to even just start by calling your legislator and letting them know that. Because we know that we really need this passed before the end of June, and they have a lot of other things on their plate. And so even if your first call, or any call of any of your friends or anyone who talks to you and says they just found it so frustrating, even if the first thing they do and the only thing they do is just talk about how it did not work well and how they want changes before November, that still creates space for the election officials and the League and Common Cause and Camille and others to be advocating for those changes. I wanted to just mention that there is also a push at the federal level. I'm sure, yes, we want funding for public education. Yes, we want funding for, still having in-person options, and that means we need funding for the sanitation supplies and the PPE and all of that. So there's so many different pieces to this. There is still about 3.6 billion that is requested. Is it billion or million? It's billion. So we asked for 4 billion. We didn't get that much. So it's 3.6 billion that we are asking the federal government for. Clearly, we're seeing the budget cuts already in Ohio. And so we're going to need to see that money flow to states. There's some other federal pieces to this as well, which is why it's really nice to piggyback what we're doing today with our action and advocacy forum on May 13th, 11:30 to 1:30, where we'll dig in a little more to solutions, and we'll have better, more detailed asks for you to make to legislators.
All right, well, you probably have noticed I have a bunch of question marks up now. This is the point that we actually move to people's questions. So, I'm going to ask the panelists a series of questions. So some of these questions actually came from before the webinar, and some of them, came today. And so this is the first question I received. How can we overcome mistrust of vote by mail among many Ohio residents? For example, voters of color, rural voters, etc. Anyone want to take that?
So I'll go. I mean, I think part of it is, people just have a lack of familiarity with the process. So continuing to do education and getting folks out there, some credible messengers to those various communities about how this process is safe and secure works. But I also think that we don't want to dismiss people's experiences of voting and having problems with voting. Historical disenfranchisement is real. And so I think that's why it's still important that we continue to advocate for early in-person options for folks who don't feel comfortable with voting by mail.
I would just say, and just for Ohio, and then we'll go on because you guys have experience of really creating that trust, but our system just doesn't work well. So what we have is a no excuse absentee, which means some people are going to choose to use it. But that doesn't mean that it really was made for prime time. And so I think one of the ways that we create more trust is to continue to improve the system to be more, voter friendly, but also more friendly for election officials as well.
think that once people interact with the system, I think education is key. They really do love it. We have really long ballots in Colorado. I hear that's the case in Ohio as well. And this gives you time to do your research, to interact with your ballot, to get help. If English isn't a language that you're comfortable in, you know, you can talk to your friends and neighbors and get those resources from the privacy of your home. I also think it's important to meet voters where they're at, and so you can't sacrifice those in-person neighborhood options. And I think the other thing that we've done is we've included some equity measures within our laws themselves. So for example, in choosing where to put voter service and polling centers, clerks have a set of about 9 different criteria, many of which focus on equity when deciding where those locations should be. And there's opportunity for voter feedback. So one place where we've seen hiccups on this is some elections officials are really excited about putting vote centers in police departments. They see these as community centers that people know where they are. For a number of our community members, those are not safe spaces. And so we have opportunities to have community input and make sure that the voting resources that we're offering people are culturally competent. So I think there are some sort of norming things that you can do as a community. And then I also think there are some safeguards that you can put into law.
One of the biggest questions, and I got this repeatedly, if you're advocating for vote by mail, does that mean that you don't support in-person voting? For any of you who
collective no.
There was a big, shaking of the head. Kate, do you want to add something?
I think someone touched on it earlier. No one votes entirely by mail. Even an all-mail system or a full vote by mail system, you still need to have options, and they're not in competition. It's just voting by mail. It does tend to end up being the preferred method and a more convenient method for the vast majority of people. So if that's a streamlined, efficient, regular part of your process, you're going to catch a lot of people and make it a lot easier for them, but you still need alternatives.
All right, now this is a question about the cost of elections. Is voting by mail cheaper or more expensive than voting in person?
Well, I can say a few. Oh, go ahead, Amanda.
It really depends on your current system. So in Colorado, by the time that we were mailing every registered voter a ballot, already about 70% of voters were voting by mail anyway. And so going from a system that was high mail turnout anyway and was also a precinct model, I think there's a solid argument that we actually saved some money in the system by moving to VSPCs and automatically mailing those ballots. That won't necessarily be the case for every state, though.
And Kate, did you have something you wanted to add?
I mean, Oregon found it saved money. The main costs are the postage and the supplies used for the vote counting. But that's still a lot less than the voting machines, the big electronic machines that have to be kept up to date for in-person. That's very expensive equipment. It reduced the hiring and training need for temp workers. I think Multnomah County, the largest county in Oregon that I live in, went initially from 3,000 workers they would have for an election down to 300. So and then there's also, though you do need to maintain drop boxes and the county election offices serve as a site for people to go in and deal with questions, you're not opening and maintaining tons of polling places all over the state. And so that reduces costs too and hassle. But again, I think Amanda's point is right. It will depend on your own situation too.
Okay, so this is with President Trump's push to the post office. What needs to happen to vote by mail? This person is worried that he's determined to stop voting. You're all a little hesitant to answer this.
We need to protect our post office regardless. this. It's core public infrastructure that helps in so many ways. There are things people would not be able to get mail on just a private mail service for if they live in out of the way areas. They might not be able to order medicine or important things. It's part of our shared public infrastructure and we need to protect it. The voting by mail, though, is just one stellar example of that. You know, a system that you don't want to trust to just anyone. And our post offices are the postal service is what makes vote by mail work. So we need to protect the postal service.
And I do love the way Kate messaged this in terms of like people getting their medicine, right? Like bottom line, you know, a lot of pharmacy, you know, it can be a lot cheaper to get your medicine through the mail, but how do you do that if you don't have a mail service that's functional because it's underfunded or been under attack? And so birthday cards, like let us, as we talk about defending the mail service, let's talk about all the things that the mail service does. Can you imagine, all of us probably have someone who sends us handwritten cards, and what those mean that all of a sudden they're going to send like a Bitmoji, so I just think, I think we need to defend the mail service as exactly that. It's public infrastructure, just like schools, just like fire departments, just like roads, and it's a public good.
Well, and this leads us to another action that we should all take, which is make sure that we let our senators and our congresspeople know that in fact we want to support the post office. So be on that, people. Okay, so this is the next question. Lieutenant Governor Husted said that all Ohioans will be mailed a ballot application for the November election. Does this go to how does this work? Does it go to all registered voters? Who will actually receive the ballot applications?
Great. And let us be clear, he did not say to send ballots to everyone, even though that's something that the voting rights groups think would certainly incentivize voting by mail. But he said applications to all, and we support sending applications to all. And, in some years we have applications only going to people in active status. This is actually supposed to go, if you see how Secretary LaRose priced it out for the postage cost, it would be for every voter on the file. That's actually really good because, and we can argue that that's a security methodology in itself, because if people are not responding to that, or it's getting returned, back to the Board of Election, that's more of an indication that that voter is no longer at that address. So I think we can argue it both ways. It can be argued that this increases access significantly because at the end of the day, if we're going to have more vote by mail because it's better in the middle of COVID, then we need to incentivize and ease the process. Mm-hmm. So applications to every voter on file helps. But the other thing you can say is it will help clean up rolls too,
All right, so this is the worst idea ever. How many votes do you think come from the cemetery? Show up and identify yourself. So if for people that are worried that in fact this is being taken advantage of, and they're worried about fraud, what would you have to say about that?
I mean, I hope it gives folks peace of mind to know that that has not been our experience in Colorado. That we have the security measures that we've previously talked about, and by and large, they work. And that this is a system that really makes it convenient and accessible for voters throughout the state to vote, and that it largely hasn't been a problem. And I also want to point out that you do have to show an ID during the process, and that signature verification step is also really, really important. So it's not the case that there's just ballots going out willy-nilly and there's no check on who's returning them. That's not the way this operates.
So the next person was worried about what's actually on the absentee ballot application in Ohio. In bold print above the signature line, it says, "I hereby declare under penalty of election falsification that I'm a qualified elector." And then in a bold print, it says, "Whoever commits election falsification is guilty of a felony of the 5th degree." If I wasn't 100% sure I was currently registered and that my name had not been purged, I would be afraid to vote by mail. How many law-abiding citizens are actually worried and just don't decide to vote by mail?
So this year, if you're getting an application, that means you're a registered voter. So you wouldn't need to be worried that you've been purged or you're, acting inappropriately. So, I mean, anyone right now can go to voteohio.gov and check their registration and update their registration if they want to see what the address is on file. And so I think that's a really simple step for voters to do.
I think the questioner, though, has raised a good question. Not everybody is familiar with the process. So if you've done it before and you have access to online, you've learned these things over time. You might be a new voter, just young. You might be somebody who really never believed that a one vote made a difference because you didn't see that in your community. But then at 50 years old, some organizer on your doorstep convinces you otherwise and you vote for the first time. Whatever your story is, not all voters feel that sense of trust. So I do think there's a responsibility on the election system to really try to make this information, to do a lot of public PR about this so that voters understand how it works. And especially when there's changes in the system, when we're unfolding something new. And in those cases, when like under a crisis like this, where we're making some changes rapidly, I think all of us should assume responsibility. Collectively, as organizations, we should try to let our friends and our followers know. And as individuals, we should reach out to the people we know through whatever channels work and make sure people understand how these things work. Because I do think it can be intimidating for some people.
Absolutely. Okay, so this person is concerned about whether, when we make any changes, whether we're using an equity lens, and wants to know a little bit about, the reforms that we support and how we put an equity lens on that. And this is for Ohio.
Thank you for that question. I don't know who that is, but I think that's awesome. So first off, that's one of the main reasons why the league would never support a 100% vote by mail system. So the bottom line is that we support more vote by mail accessibility. But even, as the systems in other states where it's primarily vote by mail, there's in-person voting. And that is by itself an equity consideration. We're going to have individuals with disabilities. We're going to have individuals of, communities of color, folks who just don't really get their mail that easily. A lot of different kinds of folks that are going to want to vote in person, and we need to preserve that. But I also think some of the other things that we talk about in terms of equity, only one early vote center per county really is not equitable, bottom line. Right? Other things we talk about, we want prepaid postage for the applications and the ballots. That's about equity. It shouldn't be about, who can more easily afford a stamp. Or for some of us, like if you think about younger folks that pay everything online and just don't really have stamps, believe it or not. I am not that young and I don't have any stamps. I pay everything online. So there's a lot of equity means ultimately in voting is that there's many different ways to access the system. And I'd finally argue that that's one of our concerns about our protocols, and really lack of protocols when it comes to signature matching, because we do find, because we don't have this robust potential system or set of protocols, as we heard Amanda and Kate talk about for signature verification, that senior citizens, people with disabilities, young voters, new Americans are all more likely to be denied either their provisional ballot or their application or whatever, because of a signature, because it's deemed to be a signature mismatch. So the truth is that we are questioning every aspect of the system and considering equity and considering different groups. And I will say that I'm super thankful that we are, this group, Catherine and Camille and the League, we all have both a lot of know-how and knowledge at the local level to support voters and know what voters are experiencing, that actively, along with all of our election protection volunteers and friends, that is actively informing every policy that we are advocating for so that we can think about equity and access.
All right, now I have shall we say, both a simple question and one that may test you. Are you feeling like Wikipedia? It is, how many registered voters are there in the state of Ohio?
Something like 7.7 million.
Boom, she won. I was gonna say, the good answer. All right, so the next one was, this is a question for you, Amanda. The question is, please elaborate on how you do the voter list updates. Like you talked about your voter rolls being updated and being in good shape. How do they do that?
I had a slide, but I decided not to bore you, and I clearly underestimated the nerdiness of our crowd. So thanks for that. Pretty complicated process, actually. And it's everything from, we have monthly updates from a national address verification. We get regular list. We have automatic voter registration here as well. So we get nightly list from the DMV. I updated my address on my license, and 3 days later, I got a letter from my county clerk saying, it looks like you moved. We're gonna start sending your ballot here. Is that what you wanted? We get felon and death record notifications that are uploaded daily into our system. And then we get regular registration lists in real time because we have that statewide electronic system. So here we actually don't have the same provisional issues that you all sound like you have, because that system is live and electronic. And so if I've mailed in my ballot, they have a record of it when I get to the voter service and polling center. So they're not going to need to give me a provisional ballot. They're not going to give me a ballot because they're going to say, looks like you already voted. The same thing would happen if I tried to vote at 2 different BSPCs on the same day. So part of it is having that centralized electronic system that allows us to upload all this data into one place, and then that automatic voter registration process that works pretty well here.
And this is for Kate. How much voter fraud has been found in any of these states? Answer for Oregon.
I don't have the any exact specifics on that, but from a more generalist answer from what I'm aware of from doing this work, it's very minimal. It's not that it's not a concern. Obviously, we all need to be worried about that, but that, you know, what you do have occasionally is somebody who votes accidentally. Like we had a situation in Oregon in the last election where somebody had moved at an awkward time and they ended up with 2 ballots, and they cast both of them without even really, like they thought they hadn't done, they thought they'd done it, but then here was this other ballot and maybe they hadn't, and they but you know, I'm not aware of significant fraud.
Amanda, any worries about fraud in your neck of the woods?
I think that we are all concerned about this, and that we know that we need safe and secure elections, right? It's why we invest in the infrastructure that we've invested in. That being said, I think that we are all vigilant. We understand the importance of secure elections, and we largely don't see fraud, and definitely don't see it on a large scale.
Okay, so this question is to the Ohioans. What objections or roadblocks do you expect from the state legislature? And the thing for people to keep in mind is that the state legislature generally leaves by the end, you know, it's a full-time legislature, but they generally leave by the end of June. What kind of roadblocks to improvements do you expect?
All right, I'll take that. I think, okay, so first off, Something like this online absentee ballot request system is something that Secretary of State LaRose actually had a bill on when he was a senator. Republican Teresa Gavarone has a bill on that right now. That before COVID, the voting rights groups, the election officials, the Secretary of State were all coming in and supporting, and it just wasn't moving, right? Like one of the things we see, I think, in Ohio is just kind of not that much inspiration from the legislature to really upgrade and update our systems. I don't even know sometimes if it's that, like, I don't think that one was even controversial. They just didn't do it. I think other times it can be controversial. So I do think the truth is that a legislative inertia is one of the biggest challenges that we have in Ohio. And so that's why more than getting the exact right talking points on what we need the policies to be, we just need every Ohioan to be calling and talking about how we need a better solution. But I do think there could be some other pieces about prepaid postage. We, of course, will hear some concerns about fraud, and we know that that's exceedingly rare. Every Secretary of State in Ohio, Republican and Democrat, has said that for decades. And so we'll see some different pushback.
And this one is for Amanda. How has vote by mail popularity changed campaigns?
You know, I think that we all know, I assume we all know because you're spending your time with us tonight, that our systems are just inherently made better when we all participate, right? That our democracy is stronger, we make better decisions as a community when all of our voices are heard. And I think that when you have turnout the way that Colorado does, we have more elected officials and we have people who are running ballot initiatives who realize that they have to talk to all voters, right? That they can't just talk to this small subset of people and expect that that's okay, that we need to bring more people in and that everybody's voice does matter because we're all voting. And so I think that's a really important part of our system, is that we're realizing how important everyone's voice is.
For everybody. Okay, so the next question is from Oregon and Colorado. How do you handle provisional ballots? Up to you, Kate. Or, okay.
So we don't see nearly the number of provisional ballots that we saw before we went to this model. Part of that is for a number of the reasons that I've already talked about, in that we have a better statewide tracking system. The other two pieces of that is same-day voter registration, right? A lot of the reasons that you might receive a provisional ballot is that our system isn't sure if you're eligible to cast that ballot, or you haven't registered or something like that. And so we've gotten rid of a lot of those problems with same-day registration. The problem that we sometimes see is when people live in one county and vote in another, right? Because you need to go to a VSPC that's in your county. And so sometimes you forget of, oh, I live in Jeffco and I'm working in Denver and I can't just go to the one that's right next to my office. One of the ways that we have changed that is we actually now have a statewide ballot that doesn't have the pieces of your ballot that are specific to your local. And so say, you know, polls are closing at 7, you totally forgot that an election was happening, you ran to the VSPC that was closest to your office, and gosh darn it, that's not your county. Now, and this is the change in 2019, you have the option of casting that statewide ballot so you can at least vote on the issues that are statewide. And so with all of those different policies, we don't see nearly the number of provisionals. And so we have more people getting to cast their ballot and have that ballot accurately counted.
Well, we are at 8:30. So this is the very, very last question. Is there any evidence of voters being better informed about the candidates with vote by mail system?
I don't know if there's scientific, well-documented evidence of that. There may be, and if anybody knows of studies, I'm actually really interested. But I will say anecdotally, it feels that way in Oregon. you know, my experience voting here, and I've voted in several other states in my life, and I have family and friends, of course, in other places who vote in different ways, is that there's much more discussion. Voting doesn't happen in a box in a 15-minute period. It happens over a 3-week period where you've got your ballot and you might sit down to fill it out one weekend and then realize there's several things you don't know about. And so you hold off until you've had a chance to talk to the people that you trust or look something up online or whatever you do.
So I think we've all heard in Ohio about, you know, someone who said, yeah, the only thing I didn't vote on was I didn't know about this issue. So I just left that one blank, or I didn't know that this candidate was on there. So of course I couldn't be a leaguer and not mention that you can get your sample ballot at vote411.org and learn all about the issues and candidates.
Now, before we completely say goodbye, I did want to highlight this. This was from John Dice, who was concerned about changing Ohio law to reflect that the post office no longer does the postmarks, and that this is something to take into account. Now, you all, I'm sure, are aware of, you had many, many more questions, and we didn't necessarily get all the answers. What we're going to do is we're going to follow up so that you can get the recording, and I'll do kind of as quick as I can, put together kind of answers to some of your questions. And if I can't answer them myself, I'm going to bother these wonderful experts. And I just really wanted to say thank you very much to the League of Women Voters of Ohio. I wanted to say thank you to the League of Women Voters of Greater Cleveland that helped to make this possible. And then thank you, Jen. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Camille. And big thank you to Mia. A thank you to Izzy, who managed to keep us going with this webinar. And a big thank you to Michael Barron, who decided that we actually needed to do this today. And so you all be well, be safe, and thank you so much for participating. We just really appreciate it. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye. Have a good evening. Bye, everybody. Thank you.